Hello. In this lecture for Sex, History, and Art, we're going to cover the reign of Diocletian at the end of the 3rd and beginning of 4th century, down until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. We're also going to look at the rise of Christianity, and we'll look at how this small group of followers of this Jewish person named Jesus eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD. But when we look at religion, we have to look at it historically. For example, we cannot accept as evidence the argument God wanted it that way or God spoke to so-and-so. What we have to do is look at the historical record and see what it tells us. And we cannot make assumptions of miracles and things like that. We simply have to look at what did the people say, what did they think, and so on. So when I lecture about religion, that's the way I treat it. Just as an historian, I look at it objectively. So we're going to begin with Diocletian. I mentioned at the end of the last lecture that the Roman Empire had become very big and rather unwieldy, and a crisis occurred in which there were 33 emperors in 14 years, only 2 of whom died of natural causes. So there was a lot of turmoil in the Roman Empire, and it's not as if it ends at any time, but when Diocletian comes to power in the end of the 3rd century, he has a plan to divide the empire into 2 sections, in the east and the west. And then what he would do is appoint a co-emperor. So he chose the east because the east was where all the money was. So he was going to rule in the east, and he would appoint a co-emperor in the west. And then he had another idea, that to avoid problems of succession, if an emperor died, there would be an understudy. Each of the co-emperors would appoint an understudy, and if anything happened to them, then the understudy would take over and appoint another understudy. So that way, there would be no more turmoil. At least that was the plan. It became known as the Rule of 4, or the Tetrarchy. But something rather interesting happened with Diocletian. He became ill and decided to resign. And in Roman history, this had never happened. The only way to not be an emperor anymore was to die. But this wasn't going to be a problem because of the plan that he had put into practice. The other thing that Diocletian had done was to reinstitute the cult of the emperor. He believed that all of these, religious influences were having a negative impact on the empire, and that the one religion that had always been enforced, or for most of the empire's history, was the cult of the emperor. If you remember, Julius Caesar was deified shortly after his death, and then subsequently, after the death of very popular emperors, they were deified. They were made officially gods by the Roman Senate and worshipped as such. And as Rome expands its territory, essentially what it did was it required the peoples whom it conquered to acknowledge Rome's authority, to pay tribute, to provide men for the military, to keep order, and to worship the emperor. When you live in a polytheistic society, that's not a very big problem because, more gods, maybe, you can hedge your bets. If you're a monotheist, however, it is totally impossible. So for the Jews, and then later the Christians, worshiping the emperor was a very, very big problem. First commandment, thou shalt have no gods before me. So Diocletian decides to reinstitute this practice, which had sort of fallen off. The cult of the emperor for the Roman Empire at least brought one religion as a unifying force. It brought unity to the empire, even though people were free to worship their own gods. And as long as the conquered peoples kind of agreed to these terms, they would basically leave them in power, although, they would be under Rome's thumb. But it was, in a certain sense, a good deal for those people. And there was, a chance that, their tribal leaders could become a senator, and whenever there were Roman holidays, there'd be celebrations. Rome might build aqueducts in your hometown, an arena, be entitled to the grain rations, things like that. So this wasn't really a bad deal. But the cult of the emperor was at least one thing that brought them together. It also provided some stability, and it also reinforced hierarchy, because Rome is a very hierarchical civilization. So the cult of the emperor, at least to Diocletian, made sense, but he really took it to an extreme and then began to persecute the Christians, because they absolutely would not worship the emperor. He resigns. It doesn't work out the way that he plans it. There's immediately a struggle for power. And one general who rises to the top was a general named Constantine. But he has other rivals for power, in particular one named Maxentius. In 312, he will do battle with Maxentius at a battle known as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The night before the battle, Constantine has a dream, and he sees this vision. The Christian symbol of the key and the rho. It looks like a P with an X underneath it. It's the first two Greek letters of the word Christ, which means the Messiah. And he hears these words, "In this sign conquer." So he orders this symbol emblazoned upon his warriors' shields, and the next day they defeat Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And shortly after this, on 313, Constantine will issue the Edict of Milan, which is an edict of toleration of Christians. In addition, now that Christianity is legal, Constantine also allows them to build churches. In fact, one of the churches built at this time is St. Peter's in Rome. In a certain sense, what is happening here, Christianity is now a big part of the Roman Empire, or at least there are substantial numbers of people in the Roman Empire who are Christians. But Christianity and the Roman Empire are very different ideologies, even if we could consider them as such. What Constantine does in the beginning is to adopt this symbol as a symbol of battle, is initially killing in the name of Jesus, which, the early Christians were pacifists. Additionally, the church that he builds, the original St. Peter's, subsequently replaced by the current St. Peter's in Rome, was this magnificent Roman basilica. The early Christians took oaths of poverty. So this is a very Romanized version of Christianity, and in fact, that is one of the things that made it very palatable to Romans. By 324, there's a lot of dissent amongst Christians, and so in 325, Constantine will convene the Council of Nicaea, in which they will sort of establish the orthodoxy for the Christian religion. And he presides over this as Roman emperor, and it is thought that he converts to Christianity at some point in his life. But all of the pagan religions were still there. In 380, this is going ahead a few years, an emperor named Theodosius comes to power. And it is he who makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He decrees that the Vestal Virgins have to be disbanded. The Olympics are banned. He is also the last emperor to rule over both the East and the West, because the empire will kind of split after this. He dies in 395. In the 5th century, there were very few emperors that earned much of a distinction. There was a lot of infighting. The East was more stable than the West, but there's a lot of pressure from the people whom the Romans refer to as the barbarians, these Germanic peoples. Rome is sacked in 410, and then by 476, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus was his name, is deposed, and it is this date that historians generally attribute to the fall of the Roman Empire. But this is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire stays intact until about 1453, when it is overthrown by the Ottoman Turks. So we're going to look at the West, and we're also going to look at these Christians. When the Roman Empire collapses, much of the Roman tradition of reading and writing also goes into decline. The Middle Ages are characterized by a great lack of literacy. And it is this that gives the church great power. The early Christians, remember, were Jews. And they came out of a tradition, an apocalyptic tradition, a messianic tradition. There were plenty of people who thought that they were the Messiah. Jesus was one of them, and he has a message that's a little bit different than the message of other Jews. But Judaism, despite its orthodoxy, isn't totally orthodox. There are lots of different views of the religion and how it should be practiced. And so Jesus was one of them. Much of his life we only know from the Gospels, which were written much later after he had been crucified. And we're not entirely sure how accurate they are, and there's differences between the Gospels and so on. Later they're subject to interpretation and misinterpretation. So we have to simply look at what the historical record says. But one of the things to understand is that, Jesus has this following. And there were many of these groups in the ancient world. The early Christians coalesce around the death of Jesus. But in reality, they are different people in different places at different times with different ideas. In a sense, really how Christianity is today. It's very anti-Roman, though, the early Christians. The Romans were into, living the sweet life, displaying wealth and, instituting central authority and conquering weaker peoples and things like that. And so as it becomes mainstream in the Roman Empire, it begins to take on a lot of the characteristics, so that when Constantine legalizes it, it's very much Romanized. But even before this, there were people who believed that Christianity was becoming too worldly, and so they kind of retreat. They retreat from society and live these, what we would call a monastic life, solitary, ascetic. And eventually these people form small groups, and they live together, they worship together, they eat together, and work together, etc. And this really starts what we call the monastic movement. You have all of these monasteries that are are forming. And this becomes one of the arms of the church. But one of the traditions in these monasteries is that the monks work together. And the work that they did was transcribing books, because there were no printing presses at this time. So books had to be written out by hand. And this is the job that the monks do. We can thank them for that, because otherwise a great deal of stuff would have been lost. But on the other hand, you have to remember that if they are the ones transcribing the books, then they are also editing these books. So we don't always know if we're getting the original text or not. It gave them considerable latitude. And then you have these early leaders of the church. We call them the church fathers. And so their ideas are really not challenged. There's not a great deal of literacy in the Middle Ages, at least, to challenge their views of religion. And so their views tended to become orthodoxy. Some of those figures, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, are the best known. And much of what we know about Christian sexual history comes from them. So it's one of these things that you have to qualify, that you cannot simply say, this is what Christians thought about sex, because, again, different people with different ideas, different practices. But from a standpoint of having authority in the church, much of what the church came to believe or promote as orthodoxy came from these gentlemen, these church fathers. And they really were opposed to sex in some ways. At least they came to be opposed to sex. St. Augustine is famous for saying, God grant me chastity, but not yet. Wait till I've sown my wild oats, I guess. But eventually all three of them will come to disdain sex and marriage. And as they're reading the Bible, they're looking at the life of Jesus, and Jesus was not married, at least according to the Bibles. They're reading St. Paul, and he believed that celibacy was superior to marriage, that the body was a member of Christ, and that it should not be defiled. Celibacy meant that there would be no distractions to religious devotion. However, they understood as well that not everybody could do this, and St. Paul believed that it was better to marry than to burn with desire. But they all sort of have this notion that the flesh is evil, even though the spirit comes from God. So that brings up the issue of what about the Garden of Eden? If there was sex in the Garden of Eden, they determined that it would have been without ecstasy. It would have simply been a matter of procreation. But the fall from grace brought shame of nudity and sex. And then therefore, Mary and Jesus had to have been born without that taint of original sin, without the stain of original sin. And one way that this is explained is that of the Immaculate Conception, that Mary was conceived immaculately, and then the virgin birth, which is how they explained Jesus. So sex and procreation is kind of rationalized as a flawed state of humanity. And that if you enjoyed sex, that was the sin. And that really made virtually everyone a sinner, or most people a sinner, which meant that you had to seek forgiveness from the church. It is more of an exercise of power than it is evidence of divine forgiveness or divine redemption. It also makes contraception a sin? Because you're subverting or undermining the only legitimate purpose of sex according to the church, which is procreation. It also likewise meant that homosexuality violated that principle. There was no procreative reason for those relations, so therefore it had to be a sin. And then you have the notion of celibacy among the clergy. If you look back to Augustus's marriage laws, the one group of people who were exempt from them were philosophers. I mean, I suppose if you're a philosopher, it's probably hard enough to get a date, but then they were exempted from marriage, so they couldn't even force someone to marry them. And that tradition is thought to have carried over into the church. As one way, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons. But celibacy among the clergy, because after all, remember, Jesus was not married. There's no evidence that he ever slept with anyone. So the highest state of religious devotion would be celibacy. But this took centuries to make happen, and it really isn't until Gregory VII in the 11th century that a decree is formally issued by a pope banning the clergy from engaging in sex. But, as you can probably guess, there were many, many violations of that then and now. It's very, very difficult to enforce this. Now, the church can certainly excommunicate someone if they're caught, but you have to get caught first. And it also didn't help that a lot of the popes, certainly the Renaissance popes, were well known for their libidos. But we'll get to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance afterward. Right now, we're just sort of looking at the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. So we look at the Roman Empire and this whole notion of living the sweet life and Roman orgies and having a good time and all of that. And then you have these who are really the opposite of that initially. Ultimately, there had to be some concession, some reconciliation, so that a Roman could embrace Christianity, but yet not really give up the things that they cherish. So, as I mentioned earlier, there were lots of interpretations of Christianity. There always has been. So even today, people who may be devout Catholics might practice contraception. Sure, it might be a sin, but how bad is it really? That sort of thing. And then it becomes a matter of bargaining, I suppose. But for the Romans, those concessions were really the main reason why Christianity was accepted at all. It's sort of like when St. Paul is initially trying to preach to the Gentiles. One of the symbols of the covenant between God and the Jewish people, at least for the men, was circumcision, which was done when you're an infant, when you can't really remember the pain. So as an adult, if you are going to convert to this religion, you'd have to be circumcised, and that's a big problem when there's no anesthesia. Well, St. Paul decreed that, in fact, it was not a necessity. That in order to become a Christian, you did not have to be circumcised. And so if that's the concession, then men are more likely to join the movement. So it's those concessions that we see along the way, and we certainly see them with the Romans. And that is one of the reasons why Christianity becomes the official religion. But when we look at the historical record, on one hand you have, the Roman sensibility, and on the other hand you have St. Augustine, who's writing, about the sins of sex and things like that, as a way to sort of criticize the Roman Empire, which, during the time he is writing his works, is starting to crumble. And so this is, again, as I said, a weapon, I guess you could say, that the church is using to sort of promote the behavior that it deems acceptable. So if there are problems, it's the punishment of God. And the reason for that is sex, which of course most people had engaged in. Of course, you have to do that to procreate anyway. So there are lots of concessions. It's a very complicated matter. But once we transition into the Middle Ages, things are going to be a lot more complicated even than that. But that's a lecture for next time. Thank you.